Hi, this is Cal Harrison for Information Security Media Group. Welcome to today's session entitled Mobile Apps Are the New Endpoint, featuring Chris Gogill, Vice President and General Manager for the Public Sector and APAC at Quokka. Before I introduce our speakers, just a bit of background on this session. Apps have become the new endpoint for the modern enterprise, driving productivity, revenue, and customer engagement. Globally, approximately 4 billion iOS and Android mobile devices are in use, with an average of 80 apps on each device, and each app is updated an average of 12 times a year. That means there are nearly trillions of app endpoints on devices that handle and transmit sensitive data, connect to cloud services, and access critical enterprise systems on a daily basis. Today, our speaker will discuss the risks of this large attack surface, the latest threat vectors, and proven strategies for mitigating these threats. Before we begin, let me tell you a bit about Information Security Media Group. We currently publish more than 24 international media sites, Bank Info Security and CU Info Security for financial services, Gov Info Security for the public sector, and Healthcare Info Security for the medical community, plus Info Risk Today, Data Breach Today, and Careers Info Security. Each of these sites is dedicated to providing education and news on information security. With over 1 million members registered to our websites, we have created a true information source tackling the key issues of interest to our unique audience. If you have questions for our speaker during this session, please submit them via the chat on your screen, as well as any technical issues during the webinar. I also want to emphasize that the content being presented in today's webinar is copyrighted material and is meant for today's session and individual study purposes only. If you or your institution would like to use the information presented in today's session or are looking for customized training education, please contact us. Next, a little about our sponsor. Quokka is on a mission to discover and deliver actionable mobile security intelligence to enable clients to proactively remediate zero-day exploits, providing cutting-edge enterprise mobile security and privacy solutions for apps and devices used by millions globally. Quokka enables organizations to remediate vulnerabilities proactively before they become incidents that threaten privacy, intellectual property, sensitive data, and brand reputation. Our speaker, Chris Gogill, VP and GM for the public sector at APAC at Quokka, has been working with governmental agencies in the U.S. and internationally to protect government employees and citizens from mobile threats for over 9 years. He has a graduate degree in cybersecurity, studying with Quokka's founder, Angelos Stavro, at George Mason University. The company was founded in 2011 with grants from DARPA and NIST and is the first and longest standing mobile app security solution for the U.S. federal government. Welcome, Chris. Thank you for joining.
Yeah, thank you very much. Great to be here.
This is a great topic. And I'll tell you, first off, let's just set the context. What does the mobile attack app surface look like today, and how has it evolved?
Yeah, sure. Great question to start with. Great to set the stage. I think, there's a few ways to look at it. Obviously, everyone has a device, mobile device, tablet, maybe both, maybe multiple of each. Who knows? Different for each person, each family. But when we're looking at kind of the enterprise perspective, there's really, whether you're doing management of devices or you're doing, bring your own device or a mixture of both, your mobile attack surface is really every phone or every tablet, every Android, iOS device that's accessing some sort of corporate resources, whether that's as simple as, hey, I can use my email app on my phone to check my work email or my Slack application, or even as far as I can access my private network through VPN and pull down, secure resources. There's a wide range of different deployment strategies for mobile. But in any case, the reality today is every company, every business, every government agency, every person is doing work from their mobile device. So when we're looking at that attack surface, we really have to take into account all of those situations. manage devices through MDM, bring your own device, personal devices, work device, personal device, mixture of those. It's really every device that's being used for work, either officially or unofficially in some cases. And beyond that, of course, there's applications. So as we're accessing those resources, as I'm accessing my email, my private files, my VPN, my Salesforce account, whatever it is, every one of those resources is delivered through a mobile application that's on those devices. So when we're looking at endpoints, traditionally you would look at like a laptop, desktop, server. That's an endpoint. But on the mobile space, each application is really its own endpoint because it shares and stores its own data in a private little section on your device. It has its own connections and its own code, how to connect, how to transfer data, process data, store data. Every single application on your mobile device is really its own endpoint. So it really changes the picture as compared to when we're looking at traditional desktop management, endpoint detection for servers, other things. On mobile, we really got to look at each individual application. And on average, I think the number, if I get it correctly, is about 80 applications per device on average. Many people have more. I think I have close to 200 on my phone personally. But there's a large number of these applications on each device. And then, of course, as you multiply that by the number of employees that are working for a specific organization, say 10,000 employees times 80, 800,000 endpoints potentially in that organization. And beyond that, each of those is constantly changing as well and evolving. So for more popular applications that you'll be using for work or even personal apps that are popular on your device, we see an average of around 15 to 20 updates per year for each of those apps. So not only do you have thousands and thousands of app endpoints, but they're constantly shifting and evolving over time. Whether or not you're paying attention to it is really the question. So that mobile attack surface is really very large in almost every organization and constantly evolving as well and changing and morphing as new applications are added, removed, updated. It's a very complex problem that frankly, doesn't get a lot of focus in today's world.
Yeah, there's no question. People's lives and businesses are on their mobile devices these days. So what are the threat vectors that enable malicious and even unintentional risks to mobile devices?
Yeah, sure. So I like to think of it in two main categories, like bad apps behaving badly, things that want to harm you, that are finding ways to harm folks. And then on the other side is good apps that behave badly, apps that are meant for good things. They're developed by good people, good organizations. But either for some supply chain issue or some accident in coding and in developing the app, they have some security flaw that might harm you. So we'll start with the more clear category is bad apps behaving badly. And these can range from, perfectly legal applications that are going about their business, but, are collecting data from you. And that's what we like to call harvester applications. So the most famous example that everyone in the US is aware of is TikTok. The US government is very concerned that the data is being harvested from US citizens, their behavior patterns, interests, everything being sent back to China in this case. But that's really only one example. And that company, ByteDance, that develops that app, well, guess what? They make 5, 10 other applications that don't get the same focus. And beyond that, there are thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of other applications on the App Store, some of which are just as popular as TikTok, that may be doing the exact same thing. So when we're looking at these harvester apps, I like to throw out this example of a app called Cam Scanner on iOS. So it's an Apple application. You search, you're at a business conference, you've got a document you need to scan in. Well, a lot of people don't have scanners, especially on the go, your printer scanner. Nowadays, you just use your phone to do it. So if you're looking for an application to scan something in, a PDF or a document that I want to convert to PDF, for example, you go to the App Store, type in scanner, Well, the first thing that pops up, underneath the advertisements is this app called Cam Scanner. And it's got, 5-star rating, almost 1 billion downloads, tons of users, a large user base. And of course, potentially very sensitive data, being used and transmitted by this application. If you're looking at contact information through business cards, potentially, private business data that you're scanning in with that application. And as you look at it in the back end, well, it's got about, I think, close to 100 different domains that it's communicating with, located in China, Russia, Hong Kong, and other areas. So it, is very clearly out in the open. It's not trying to hide. It's out there collecting data, whether or not the users are aware, where that data goes. And I think the kicker to this is when you look at the privacy policy, you might think you're protected by the App Store or Apple's privacy messaging that they put out. Well, the privacy policy clearly states in this case that that application does collect all of the data that you scan with it. So it's clearly placing its intent out there in the public. It's got a ton of users, and it's just collecting information. So that's what we call, harvester applications. They're out there in the wild, maybe not a specific target for your organization or a specific person, but the potential for mass data collection, at the scale of, hundreds of millions or billions of users of data that they're able to collect. So that's just one example, but there are tons of these types of applications out there. And if we flip the scale from there, that's something that's operating out in the open, very clearly open there. There's also that other angle of a subversive attack, where an application is actually doing harm behind the scenes and intentionally hiding itself. So out there in the wild, when you get your phone from the manufacturer, or you buy it online from Samsung, or you buy it from the store from Verizon or T-Mobile, wherever you get it, there's actually a large set of software applications that come pre-installed, preloaded on those devices. So when we're looking at that attack surface, there's the potential for things that are actually below the operating system level, traditional protections that are put in place on devices. So let's say, you've got something on the phone that manages the settings page, for example. You can change the font, you can change the size of the screen. A lot of these things are actually running not like an app that you download from the store, but on the core of the device. And again, intentionally or unintentionally, a lot of times they'll have vulnerabilities that can be taken advantage of. So what we see out there in the wild is actually applications that leverage these core faults on the devices to not only collect data from one specific app, like these harvester applications, but actually attack the device at its core level, which can enable things like full system compromise. We've seen back in 2016, we published a US manufacturer actually of smart devices, located in Miami, had a device that was Amazon Prime branded, #1 selling phone on Amazon in the US, that every 72 hours had the capability of sending your text messages, location data for where you've been, and a bunch of information back to a server in China. And the reason that it's able to subvert, even if you had some protections on that phone, like a mobile device management or mobile threat defense, trying to sit there and detect this sort of attack, well, those are all sitting on top on the operating system layer. The things that are operating below that core system software, are ignored by by those threats just by nature of architecture. So you have the ability there to kind of subvert the standard protections, be silent in the background, like the user can't see you, and collect massive amounts of data, and even target specific people in that case. Because when we saw this threat, they had the ability then, based on that data that's coming out, to add additional capabilities on the device. Like, hey, I see this is Chris's phone. I can add some more tracking to track his screen every hour, to see what he's doing. Or I can, install another application that's going to do other things on his device to add capabilities to our attack. So That sort of thing is on the very attacking perspective, where it's a bad app doing bad things, very bad things, behind the scenes, versus the harvester application where maybe not as impactful in terms of the attack surface, but much wider spread collection of data.
Well, you just mentioned a couple of examples of where defenses have failed on mobile devices. Why are traditional defenses unlikely to detect these types of attacks?
Yeah, because in reality, the operating systems both Apple and Google provide are just a core, kind of level playing field for developers to use. So they have a ton of different security tools that you can use, and they have a ton of different ways to implement, the functions that an app might have or a device might have. But the reality is each developer is different. Each manufacturer is different. So they all have the same level playing field. They all have the same capability to create secure applications. But the reality is each developer may not on purpose or may not in accident use all of those security features. So another great example here, I'm going to bring up a slide deck here just to walk you through visually what this type of threats are able to do and how they can subvert traditional protections. So on Android, there's a capability, and iOS as well, actually, to share data between applications. So you might be aware of how applications traditionally request data from you. They can get your contact data, location data, SMS data, like you see in this screenshot. And traditionally, you'd expect as a user, you're going to ask me, you want my location data? Send me a pop-up notification that lets me grant it for that application. So that's the standard flow that most people understand, and the operating systems provide to protect you from that data. But what you might not be aware of is applications can actually communicate with each other on your phone and share that information. So you can see, two green apps sharing your contact data, two pink, purple applications sharing location, blue sharing SMS. You can think of this in a legitimate use case, like, hey, I've got two Microsoft apps. I've got Outlook and I've got Teams, and they want to share my contact data between each other. That's the traditional way that this would be used legitimately. So what this can lead to, though, is through those code flaws, other applications can also potentially collect that data as well, unknowingly to the victim. So let's say in my Microsoft app or my other application that's collecting my contact data, they talk to that green app, but they leave that communication channel unprotected. So that attack application here, the black vacuum applications, actually can suck up that data as well. So it's intended to share with a legitimate application, but actually it can be taken advantage of through that communication channel. And because this is a developer-controlled attack surface, not an operating system controlled attack surface, the operating system isn't consulted in this case. It's only up to what the developer of that green application put in place in terms of security controls. So what does that mean? If I have this vacuum attack application installed on my device, well, my phone's privacy dashboard that's supposed to tell me what applications have access to what data from me isn't going to be accurate. It's going to subvert the operating system's detection for what that application is actually accessing on my device. And another possibility here is you could have two attack applications instead of one that's collecting data from others. You could have two that work in concert together to share data and subvert traditional detection as well, because I could have one that's requesting data, sensitive data like SMS, and I can have another that's sharing it to a server on outside my device. Together individually, if I look at one and then I look at the other, there's not an issue because one collects it, doesn't send it, the other sends data but doesn't collect any sensitive data. But together, they are actually an attack on my device and my data that I'm not aware of through traditional security tooling. So we actually looked at this in a wider scale to show the wider picture of this, but you might not be aware of is this actually was taking place back in 2018 in TikTok as well. They had the ability through another application on your phone to collect information from your notifications shade. So if you think about what shows up in your notification shade, well, every time I get a text, I get a notification. Every time I get an email, I get a notification. Every time I get a Signal or Telegram message that are encrypted end to end, well, guess what? They're decrypted to be shown in my notification so I can read it. All of that data actually was able to be collected by this app, Apex Launcher, the app in the middle here. And then TikTok actually didn't ask the end user for that data, but asked that other application for that data. So what that means is, they had access to all the sensitive data that they didn't declare directly to the operating system. And the user, of course, wasn't aware of this as well. So we actually discovered this and published this through Politico in 2019, early 2019. And of course, the developer denied knowledge of why this was in the code or why this was there. So this is something that's not only a theory, but actually in practice. And we looked at, wider, if I look at beyond, TikTok, look at beyond other applications, let's look around like 10,000 apps on the store and see what the average number of communications are. Well, on average, there's about 15 different app-to-app interactions on a device. So, I download an app on the store. On average, it's going to try to talk to 15 other apps on my phone. So you might not be aware of this at all. It's something that's happening at a wide basis, and over 10% of the applications in that sample set had more than 15, and the top application had over 12,000 interactions that it attempted on your device. So you can imagine that vacuum application from the graphic just a minute ago, trying to look and say, I'm going to try to take data from 12,000 different apps. If it's on your phone, I'm going to take data from it. So this stuff is out there in the wild, and traditional defenses aren't able to detect it because they rely on the operating system. And in this case, this is a developer to developer, threat, not a developer to operating system threat. So that's just one example of why some of these threats can't be detected by traditional methodologies, but of course there's many others out there.
Wow. Thank you for walking us through that. That's amazing. So a lot of organizations have invested in cyber defense. Why is it mobile apps are not getting the same funding and attention, as traditional, say, endpoint security?
Yeah, I think it comes down to the different platform, architecture between, mobile and more traditional endpoints. So we touched on this a little bit at the beginning, but when you're looking at protecting a laptop, a desktop, a server, the most common way that enterprises did this in the past was, all right, let's put an antivirus on. There's a potentially uncontrolled number of code pieces that could be downloaded on that device. I could go online and download an exe file or a DMG file for Mac and run it on my device. Let's try to protect that by detecting when those bad things are downloaded. And the benefit there is that the security tools can run at a very low level on those devices, like the kernel level. And we saw this with the CrowdStrike failure at the kernel level earlier this year. But the benefit there from a security perspective is that they can detect almost any potentially changed piece or bad piece of code, malware that's downloaded on that device at a very low level. So it's a pretty good detection and response mechanism for the traditional endpoint. But when we're looking at mobile now, you don't have that same capability. We've walked through several examples already where you can install an antivirus equivalent on your mobile device, but guess what? It's running just like any other app. It's running in its own siloed environment, especially on the Apple platform. There's not much capability for that app, that antivirus app, to look across the other applications on the device and see what's on there. It can only see what its own data, essentially, especially on the Apple platform, except in some specific scenarios. So the nature of the platforms is different, but the approach hasn't caught up with that. So by limiting what you can see across that device, you're less able to protect from a traditional kind of antivirus setup, that uncontrolled, that malicious code, the harvester applications. It's harder to detect because you don't have that visibility by nature just running an agent on the phone. It requires a different approach, the ability to look at those applications kind of in a black box environment and say, what is that app going to do before it even gets on my phone? What is it going to do? So it's a change in approach that hasn't quite caught up with the approaches traditionally taken to protect traditional endpoints. And I think it's also an evolution of just where cybersecurity has gone as well. Like, hey, I'm going to do the antivirus. We talked about that. I'm going to do network protection with firewall. We've seen in the last 7 years that the shift towards cloud security as well. I've got all these cloud applications now. They're no longer in my office behind a firewall on some server there. They're in the cloud. I need to protect that. But I think we're actually seeing now from that cloud shift, the shift to that mobile endpoint, the app endpoint, because, well, how is that cloud data being accessed? Over half the work done in the US government is on mobile devices. Over half. People think, traditionally, before COVID, maybe if I had to guess, but before then, 25% of the work done was on mobile. No, the reality today is over half the work done, even in the US government, is done via mobile devices. So those app endpoints that are connecting to those cloud resources, Salesforce, Dropbox, whatever it is, are becoming more and more important for cybersecurity, but also for attackers, because that's a great way to get data without going through that firewall, without trying to get on that laptop and get through the antivirus. I can just attack the mobile app because that's the new endpoint that's handling most of the corporate data.
Yeah, that makes total sense. So what's your strategy for defending mobile apps and, treating them as the new endpoint?
Yeah, great question. So I think there's a few different perspectives that our customers have. And I've done work for about over 10 years with the government and commercial sectors around mobile security. So generally, we see kind of two modes. One is let's lock down everything and only allow things that I've looked at to be on the device. So in that mode, you'd have something like a mobile device management system, like Microsoft's Intune, Ivanti's Mobile Iron, things like that. And you would limit the ability for the user to download things off the App Store. So they couldn't see anything that you didn't let them see. And in that case, you would use a technology like Quokka's to kind of be the gatekeeper to getting onto the device. Like, you want to use this new application, Uber, that lets you call taxis from wherever you are, 10 years ago. Let's look at it, see what that app's going to do before I even allow my users to use it. And so you can do things like that, like where that data is being sent. Are there any vulnerabilities in that application that will, add an entry point to my device, attack point to my device? And that's kind of what we call app vetting. So before you even deploy something, test it, make sure you understand what the risks are before it gets on the device. So of course that has some clear downsides. As an end user, I want to be able to download what I want. Otherwise, I'm just going to use my personal device. So it kind of limits the freedom of the end user, potentially limits the amount of work they can get done because they're limited to only the apps that you've looked at. Now, in some cases, it still makes sense. High security environments, you want to really have tight control like that. But what we're seeing more and more these days, over the last few years, is a shift towards open app stores. So that's great from the usability perspective. Users are able to do things like BYOD and still use their work data because they can access personal applications as well. The app store is open. But of course, that widens the attack surface even greater. You're not pre-vetting things. You kind of have to do it on the fly. So how do we do that? Regardless if you're doing mobile device management through those tools that I mentioned before, or you're doing pure bring your own device where you say, hey, just download the email app, log in, and you can access your work client on your device. uh, you need the ability to understand what every app is doing on that device in a silo, is of course, like I mentioned, but also together. So we talked about that app collusion threat, apps sharing data together. You need to be able to understand, that device's fingerprint, what applications are on it, and what are they going to do when they're on that device. And that has to be maintained over time, of course, as well as those apps are updated and changing. So we take a very similar approach to that app vetting. We are looking one by one before you let the application in, but we look at the inventory over time on any device, and then do that testing, do that black box testing, not only siloed one by one those applications, but together to understand what the threats are going to be. And the key points here, you're not able to do this, on the phone alone. You can't just, deploy an application on the device and do this. You need to be able to look at the application code, in a black box environment, and the application behaviors in a black box environment, because the platforms don't allow you to do that. You can't just install an iOS application and view everything that's on there. It doesn't. The platform won't let you do that. So you need the ability to assess those applications separate from that personal data, separate from that device, and understand the risks, and then communicate those risks either to the enterprise IT team who's managing the security, maybe even to the end user, so they understand what the applications on their device are doing and they can self-remediate. But it's really that intelligence about what the applications are doing, what threats are in those applications, and of course, those communications between those applications. That's key to protecting the mobile ecosystem.
So what are the specific use cases, for example, for developers and creators of mobile apps? What do you recommend?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, we haven't talked about that yet, so that's a great lead in. So, of course, from a end user enterprise IT perspective, you've got all these threats, you want to control them. But as a developer, of course, you want to make sure your application is not one of those entry points, or one of those leaky applications that's leaking data out. So we work with a lot of the organizations that develop, financial banking applications, retail applications, even entertainment applications, games that are on your device, because a lot of these big brands don't want their app to be in the news. So how do I limit that? Well, I want to do the same sort of testing, get the same sort of intelligence, but not on others' applications, but on my own app. And you might think, well, I could just test my code and I'm good. But the reality today is, about 75% or more of an application's code base is not made by that developer or made by that development organization. It's actually included through third-party code, through third-party libraries, and other resources, SDKs that developers package into their app. So the reality is, even if you test that 25% and it's really secure, that other code that I'm packaging in becomes my, uncontrolled attack surface, essentially, for my own application. So there's a couple ways that developers will try to assess this today. One is, hey, let's check and see if those libraries have any known vulnerabilities. And there's a lot of tools that allow you to do that. But beyond the known, just like in an application that I'm downloading from the store, there's also the unknown. Like, where does that data actually go when it's in my application? I'm giving this analytics library that tracks my user's behavior and allows me to improve my application. But where is it actually sending that data? Is it going to another nation? Is it going to a separate application on the device that I wasn't aware of? How is it handling that data? Is it encrypting it properly to my standard as a development organization? There's a lot of questions that aren't answered by simply checking for those known vulnerabilities. So we also apply this contextual intelligence not only for other apps, but for developers' own applications, so they can see their entire mobile app supply chain, all those different libraries that are siloed and funneled into their application. Are they meeting my own standard for behavior, for privacy, and for in some cases compliance as well?
And then what about use cases for enterprise IT, security workers who, are responsible for deploying these apps?
Sure, sure. So we talked a little bit about the kind of app vetting methodology, and then the other methodology of kind of tracking over time, but let's focus in a little bit more on that. So how do I actually pull that off? So there's two main deployment models there. You have your managed device and your bring your own device. So the managed device will be, again, managed through a tool like Microsoft's Intune management function. Um, and you can actually have an open app store on that managed device, but how do I know that my device is secure, your device is secure today, an hour from now, 2 days from now, 2 weeks from now, a month from now? Well, you have to constantly assess that inventory of applications and the behavior and interactions of those applications. So they actually can apply a connection between the existing tooling that's already there, the management tooling, and something like Quokka's contextual intelligence. And we do that through our product called QScout. So what that does is it integrates directly into those management tools, sees the inventory on every device, and then applies that intelligence layer to that MDM to provide the security layer on top of the management layer. So, they can assess, my device today, my combination of applications, what applications individually are causing an issue. Like maybe I have that cam scanner app and they don't want that data to go out to China, for example. So they let me know or they remove it from my device. That's one scenario. Or, I potentially have an application that's leaking data to the other apps on my phone. So maybe they enforce a permission change for that and say, hey, this application, even though it asks for your contact data and uses it, it's actually leaking that contact data to the other apps. So, hey, remove that permission and plug that leak. There's different ways that they can then remediate the issues detected by combining those two technologies. So that's kind of the managed device layer. And then in a lot of organizations, especially small and medium businesses, there's going to be no management function. It's going to be essentially a Wild West. Use your phone, do your best to keep yourself safe, and do your work on it. And that's really bring your own device, whether it's a formal policy or just a de facto policy. That's the other area. So on that side, you can actually deploy. You don't need to go all the way to the MDM, which is very heavy in terms of configuration, ownership cost from an organization. It takes some man hours to manage. You can do something else. We call it the personal device management. So you give a lot of those core functions that the managed devices get, but without the heavy cost to the ownership for the IT organization. And critically, without the heavy cost potentially to privacy from the end user, because it's not looking at controlling their device. It's just looking at providing that security layer. So allow me to see what's on your device. I'll tell you what the threats are. And then you can self-remediate or get guided remediation to make yourself more secure. So there's kind of two main areas there that we see in the enterprise space.
So obviously Qualcomm's been around a long time in this space. How are you helping customers tackle all these challenges?
Yeah, so I think there's, obviously the product and implementation perspective. So we look at helping them with that app vetting. If for organizations that are still in that mode, we help with the contextual intelligence layer through our product QScout. In that mode I mentioned. For the developers we talked about, we provide a testing platform called QMast, which integrates into their development lifecycle, helps them detect and protect against these threats in their own applications. So of course, in that mode, we're helping a lot of organizations today actively protect themselves from these threats. But another portion of what we do is actually focus on leveling up the standards and awareness of these threats. So this forum is a great one to help with that awareness perspective. Every time I talk, in the last 12 months about that app collusion threat, almost everyone in the room or listening hasn't heard of this, this potential, and it's on their devices today. Applications are sharing data, but people just aren't aware of this type of thing. Even this things as simple as harvester applications, like being aware of what you do and what you install on your device and where that data could potentially go. People are just by de facto, trusting their device, trusting the app store. Apple's got my back, Google's got my back. But again, the reality is that app store security level is a global security level. They're servicing all nations and all different types of end users. Your appetite for security and privacy is likely different than that app store's appetite for security and privacy, especially if you're in an organization that's an enterprise organization that's got sensitive data to protect. Then your appetite is definitely different. And if you're in the government, your appetite's even more restricted. So looking at the lens of, hey, that's the base security level, but what's my security level when I'm looking at these applications and downloading them from the marketplace? So awareness is a big part of it, to enable people to be smarter and more safe on their devices, even in their personal lives. But we also work with governments globally on standardization as well for mobile security. So beyond implementing security technologies, how do we judge what safe is and what's a good practice? So a great recent publication out in Singapore, actually, Singapore government cybersecurity agency there published the Safe App Standard. So when I'm looking at any app, whether it's from the App Store or it's my application that I developed, or it was on some website and I downloaded it because it offered me free coupons, whatever it might be, how do I know what safe is? And that's a really powerful question, actually, especially as we look at the tea leaves going forward. DOJ suing Google to open up their App Store ecosystem, the EU suing Apple to open up their App Store ecosystem. So even those base levels of security that Google and Apple provide today through their own app stores, well, 2 years from now, 5 years from now, there may be 5 different app stores I can choose from, each with their own level of security. So that question of how do I know what safe is becomes even more and more important. So the Safe App Standard is a great project that the Singapore government has been working on and helping to collaborate there. And then, of course, the US government also has different regulations, most of which are made for government agencies, but some of which provided by NIST, National Institute for Standards and Technology, actually provide guidance for enterprises generally, not just government. So they have a couple projects driven through their National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, NCCOE at NIST, led by a program led by Gemma Howell over there at NIST, that's published a few different publications, one for corporate-owned personally enabled devices, one for bring your own device, and then one more general focused around securing mobile devices in the enterprise. So those provide great base guidelines, covering some of these use cases we talked about today about how do I, create a secure mobile ecosystem in my organization. Even if I'm not government, I'm just an enterprise. How do I do that? So we take pride in participating in these different efforts, to help bring that level of security up, whether it's through implementation of our tools or just generally helping in the awareness and standardization process.
So what distinguishes Quokka in an increasingly crowded marketplace?
Yeah, I think it's really our core technologies. So you've heard me talk about the contextual intelligence a few times, and it's where that comes from. So we developed over the last, well, what is it, 2014, almost 2015, 2025, over the last almost 15 years, our core tech in-house, wholly developed by Quokka engineers. And what it does is it powers that contextual intelligence about applications. So it can take in any arbitrary app, whether it's your app, whether it's an app from the store, whether it's an app from online. It doesn't need access to any of the source code for that application, just the same thing that you would download and install on your phone. And it can assess it from many different perspectives. You heard me talk about security. Of course, there's a security perspective, privacy perspective, where's data going, behavior, how does it use that data, beyond asking for my contact data? How does it actually use that data? Um, and there's a few different lenses there. Obviously, the collusion. What other apps does it talk to? And all this data is actually assessed by our technology. We've got about 11 or 12 different academic papers describing these approaches that we've developed over time. But essentially, what we're able to do then is understand exactly what the Singapore government's looking at is what is safe. Whether or not it's your app, whether or not it's a vendor app that I'm purchasing and using in my organization, what is safe on my phone? And as a combination, what is safe? So we've specialized over time in creating that database, of knowledge, what applications are doing, what their security threats are, what their privacy threats are, of course, what their compliance status is. And then actually recently, we've done something unique on top of all this data. So we've generated all this information, from our technologies, and now we're actually applying, machine learning modalities looking back at that data. So that 10, 12, 15 years of data about applications, we can actually then train a model to learn, what is benign or normal behavior and what is malicious behavior. So this is a new lens of something that we haven't actually talked about today is, just general malware. We look at the antivirus on our device, on our Windows or Mac machine, looking for malware. There are other applications that look for malware on mobile. But what we're doing is a little bit different. Instead of that signature-based detection where I'm looking at that file hash, I'm looking at that fingerprint to try to match it and say, this file is malicious, one-to-one, or even, this library that's in this application is malicious, one-to-one. We're looking at that behavioral model and saying, what does the behavior say? Beyond if it's recognized in a malware library repository from VirusTotal or, Reversing Labs, whoever it might be. Of course, that's good to detect, and that's a step in the right direction. But for the things that aren't in there, what's malicious? And is that application that I'm installing on my device or that's been observed on my device malicious in terms of the behavior that it has? So this is something that's really powerful, we think, because things like polymorphic malware, apps that are actually causing harm to citizens and enterprises in terms of stealing banking funds, other things from their device, they're often evading the App Store's detection. They're evading traditional antivirus detection because they're constantly shifting and evolving themselves. So it's a kind of a never-ending game if you're just trying to, make a hash for each one, make a signature or fingerprint for each one, and try to detect the next one. As soon as they change it, well, that's not going to be in that database anymore. So this approach actually is unique, I think, in the market where we're looking at, that data set that we have generated and saying, well, I haven't seen this in a library before of known malicious applications, but looking at its behavior patterns, how it uses that personal data, how it uses those special permissions on the device. Is this application actually behaving maliciously? Is it behaving like a Trojan? Is it behaving like a dropper application, or other different types of malicious apps? So I think that's what Quokka brings, is that unique data set, both on that more traditional understanding of what the app does, but also now on this perspective of, is it malicious or not as well.
This is great. So where can our attendees go to learn more about mobile app risks and the solutions?
Yeah, obviously Quokka.io is a great place to start learning about Quokka a little bit more. We have a great blog on there covering some of these threats, harvester applications, colluding applications. There's different blogs. There's even a couple posts about the TikTok research that we did. You saw a slide on that during today's presentation and discussion. So that's a great place to start, of course. Keep up with news, more recent blogs. And of course, there's a resource center as well for more detail around the technologies, products, and kind of that core tech. And beyond that, actually, the things that we find with it. So I didn't mention we have, I think, over 235 CVEs or 0 days published by our organization that we found with this technology. And you can actually look at all of those going back 10 plus years on our website as well. And then beyond Quokka, I mentioned a few resources that you should definitely check out. NIST's, their guidance around mobile device security, bring your own device and corporate own device security, and that can be found just on nist.gov. And then the Singapore's CSA's Safe App Standard on csa.gov.sg. That's a great resource to look at as well. And if you're learning about how do I judge security of an app.
Well, Chris, this has been great. Thank you so much for making the time today.
Yeah, appreciate all the questions and the responses. It's been a great discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. I also want to thank our attendees for taking time out of your day to hear us talk about mobile apps, the new Endpoint. We hope to see you again at one of our upcoming events for Information Security Media Group. I'm Cal Harrison.